After weeks of protests and trade threats over the Trans Mountain pipeline, the premiers of Alberta and BC came together in Ottawa today. And while they didn't reach a consensus, the Prime Minister made clear his government will do what it takes to push the project forward.
The Government of Canada's objective has been clear: to develop the vital infrastructure that is critical to our ability to get Canadian resources to global markets.
So here's what's at issue. Kinder Morgan wants to expand the existing 60-year-old Trans Mountain pipeline that runs from outside Edmonton to Burnaby, BC. It's a $7 billion project that would nearly triple the capacity of the current pipeline and give Alberta's oil sands more access to Asian markets. But that also means an increase in tanker traffic on the West Coast, and that's what has the BC government and environmentalists concerned. The premiers emerged from their 2-hour meeting with neither side backing down from this escalating feud. As David Cochrane explains, the line from the federal government, enough is enough.
The Prime Minister interrupted an international diplomatic trip to deal with a domestic political feud, throwing the might and the money of the federal government behind Alberta to get a pipeline built to the BC coast.
The Trans Mountain pipeline expansion is a vital strategic interest to Canada. It will be built.
Ottawa will start formal talks with Kinder Morgan to put taxpayers' money behind the pipeline. The details and the dollars it will take to calm investors won't be known until the negotiations are over.
We will not have these discussions in public, but construction will go ahead.
The details may not be firm, but Alberta's premier, who is also putting money on the table, says this is the concrete action she wanted from Trudeau.
I am quite confident that the nature of the conversation that we are having at this point will get the job done.
Between the three of us, we continue to disagree on the question of moving diluted bitumen from Alberta to the Port of Vancouver.
Nothing in the meeting moved John Horgan's line in the oil sand. He's not dropping his lawsuits or his objections to the pipeline, which he calls a giant environmental risk.
My obligation is to the people of BC, and I'm going to defend that until I'm no longer the Premier.
So Trudeau is also promising legislation, new laws that will assert federal authority over the pipeline and limit BC's ability to delay it. That's on top of what will be big taxpayer cash, and he blames John Horgan for the bill.
I don't think we would be in this current situation if the British Columbia government hadn't continued to emphasize its opposition to the project.
But along with that verbal stick came a financial carrot, a willingness to work with BC to boost the $1.5 billion coastal protection plan to further guard against possible spills. A diplomatic offer on a day of flexing federal muscle.
We are one country with a federal government that is there to ensure that that national interest is upheld.
Trudeau clearly has the stomach for this fight. He will soon find out if Kinder Morgan does too. David Cochrane, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now, this is not the first time the Canadian government has stepped in to save a project or an industry. In 2009, the then Conservative federal government and Ontario invested $13.7 billion in GM and Chrysler as part of a broader North American auto bailout. But that happened during a global economic meltdown. More recently, the Liberal government offered Bombardier $372 million in interest-free loans while the company was struggling. The government of Quebec invested $1 billion in 2015. And it's not the first time Ottawa has invested to keep an energy project afloat.
Hibernia means dignity. Dignity for all Newfoundlanders.
In the 90s, Brian Mulroney's government took a stake in the Hibernia oil project when it was close to collapse. There's a lot of money at stake here, too, but for each of the leaders at today's emergency meeting, there is a potential political cost as well. Justin Trudeau has promised to balance the environment and the economy. That will be put to the test here. Not to mention, the Liberals have 18 seats in BC, and they want to hold on to those. Alberta's Rachel Notley has no choice but to aggressively defend the pipeline. Thousands of oil sands jobs depend on it. And come the next election, the NDP will be in a tough fight with the newly united Conservative Party, already accusing Notley of not standing up for the interests of her province. And in BC, John Horgan's minority government is only able to stay in power with the help of the Green Party, which is vehemently opposed to the pipeline. So while Horgan has made his position clear, not everyone in BC opposes the pipeline. Tonight, Briar Stewart has reaction from both sides of this divisive issue.
Not far from where the new Trans Mountain pipeline would end,
it was built out of one cedar tree.
stands what Indigenous groups are calling a watch house.
I think it's only fitting we put it here.
It's part of a long-standing protest against a project the Prime Minister is committed to.
It's totally unacceptable for him to want to push this through, you know, from Alberta coming through our traditional territories to this body of water that we're protecting. It's unacceptable to carry on.
No, Kinder Morgan! While the political maneuvering continues, those here say so will the protests. While some First Nations are strongly opposed to this pipeline and are challenging it in court, dozens of others have signed lucrative agreements with Kinder Morgan and are frustrated that they could lose out on millions if the project doesn't go ahead. The Whispering Pines Clinton Indian Band was the first to sign an agreement with Kinder Morgan, and the chief says they're losing out on jobs and tax revenue, which should already be coming their way.
Had they started this in 2014, we would be covering the pipe back up. But, you know, we're still 6 months from shovels in the ground. And so those are the kinds of things that my community finds annoying.
While groups remain divided over the pipeline, there's another layer that complicates this project, the issue of just who should have say over what.
It sounded like Premier Horgan had been called into the principal's office.
Jocelyn Stacey is a law professor at UBC. She says even if the federal government tries to reaffirm its jurisdiction through new legislation, that too could end up being challenged in court.
There's no question that the federal government has constitutional authority over the pipeline. Where there's uncertainty is over the effects of the pipeline on the environment, and the environment is shared jurisdiction.
Which is why the politics around the pipeline remain so complicated, and why even after all this time, there are still no guarantees about its future. Briar Stewart, CBC News, Vancouver.